Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about evaluating qualitative research. So first we'll go over an introduction. What is qualitative research and why do we want to evaluate it? Then we'll talk about how to start. What's the first thing we do when we're evaluating and validating qualitative research? We'll talk about the who and the why. We'll talk about the how. We'll talk about the checks and balances. We'll do some final thoughts and conclusions, and then I'll make sure you have an opportunity for questions at the end. So science is never a lie, right? No. Scientists are just like any other human being. We are capable of lying. Okay, it was not long ago in the news that a Harvard professor, who was ironically enough studying dishonesty, was accused of falsifying data in her research. So just because a piece of research is published in a book or published in a journal or published online, right, just because it's scientific research and it's published does not mean that it is good quality research. Doesn't mean that the data wasn't falsified. So what we want to do is as consumers of research, we want to ensure that the research that we are consuming is good quality research. And how do we do that? Okay. Well, we are going to talk about today, we're going to talk about validation and evaluation. So if we look in the dictionary, the verb to validate something is to prove the accuracy of that something. If we look at the verb evaluate, that is to judge the quality of or determine the significance of something. So again, we're going to look at accuracy, we're going to look at quality, and we're going to look at significance. So where do we start? Well, let's start with the significance piece. When we talk about reading scientific literature, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, I've always told you to start with the abstract. And that is because we want to be sure before we invest our time and energy into reading an article that it is going to have significance to us, the reader. The abstract is your elevator pitch for the research. So it's going to tell you what the researcher was studying, what their question was. It's going to share a snapshot of the data and often a conclusion. So this is going to let us know right away, does this research have significance to me, the reader? Is it what I'm looking for? You cannot always tell by the title, right, if the research is going to answer the questions that you have. So always start with the abstract. Okay. Once you've read the abstract and you've determined that, yes, this is research that I'm still interested in, this is research that's going to answer a question I have, then we want to look at the who and the why. So who are the researchers? What biases might and preconceived notions might those researchers have? And equally as important, who is funding or supporting the research? And do they have hidden motives? So for example, a study on the effects of global warming that's sponsored or funded by the auto industry is, maybe going to raise a few red flags, right? I'm not so sure I would trust any data coming out of that study. Or a study on the effects of excessive sugar in the brains of small children that's funded by the Iowa Corn Growers Association. Okay. If we think corn, we think high fructose corn syrup. I'm pretty sure, there might be some hidden motives there for the Iowa Corn Growers Association to, maybe kind of direct that research. So who is funding or supporting the research? There are definitely some reputable funding agencies out there. For example, if I see that research is funded by the NSF or the NIH, I know that that research is going to have been conducted with no strings attached, right? So the funding isn't going to force the researcher into a specific direction or not. And why is the study being conducted? And again, this gets back into that, what are they looking for? What are they trying to find? Why is this particular study being conducted? The how is as important as the who and the why. So once you've read the abstract and you know the background of the study, you know who's doing it and how they're being funded, and you're still interested, now you want to look at the how. And you can typically find the how either under the introduction or under a separate methodology section, depending on how the article is structured. There is no one size fits all method to answer all research questions, no matter what kind of research you're doing. So what you really want to be looking for is, does the method fit the intended question? For example, if I am looking at the housing shortage in Los Angeles, California, and how that affects the Latino population, and I interview one person in all of LA County, right, is that going to give me the answer that I'm looking for? No, probably not, right? I mean, that's a pretty broad topic. How does the housing shortage in LA affect the entire Latino population? If I speak with one person, right, that is no, that's red flag, right? Not answering my question. On the other hand, if I'm looking at a rare genetic disease and how the family dynamics shape how they deal with this rare genetic disease, right, and it affects less than 1% of the population, then perhaps an in-depth series of interviews with one patient and or one family, that might fit, right? Because we're talking about a rare genetic disease that few people have. So no one size fits all method, but does the method fit with what the researcher is trying to find? Okay. Checks and balances. So once we've looked at the method, right, and we've looked at, does it fit with what we're looking for? We also want to look at, did the researcher employ any checks and balances? Again, just like with the methodology, there is no one size fits all answer here. What we're really looking for is, does the researcher have some sort of guardrails on their research? And do those guardrails fit with what they're looking to do? So this is not an exhaustive list of all the possible guardrails out there, but it's a small sample. For example, triangulation. Triangulation is the notion of looking at our data and making sure that we're pulling multiple types of data and or data from multiple sources. So in our previous example of the housing shortage in Los Angeles, maybe that study has data, a large pool of data that's quantitative in nature, demographic data, housing data. Maybe they sent out surveys to hundreds of families. And then they did one in-depth interview with one or two families. Well, then in that case, that particular data set and or research might have more meaning than the research who only did one interview with one person and then purported to answer the question, how does the housing shortage in LA affect the Latino community? Negative analysis. That is the notion that the researcher is willing to look at alternative explanations. So they're not so focused on one theory or one explanation that they're unwilling to look at alternative explanations. They also need to be willing to admit or answer the question of whether or not all of their data fits with their theory. So again, we're talking about people, and people are unique and different. And maybe you interview 100 people and 90 people all have the same experience and answer in similar ways, and you find things that fit with your theory about what you're studying. But 10% of them had completely different experiences that don't mesh with your theory. That's okay as long as you acknowledge that, right? As long as you acknowledge that it was not all 100% one size fits all answers. We talked a little bit about bias, but recognizing it and acknowledging it. So saying, yes, coming into this study, this is my background, and here is where I might have preconceived notions or biases. So bias is not a bad word. It's okay to have biases, but recognizing them and laying them out there for the reader to decide whether or not that has influence on your research. Another method that could work depending on what you're doing and what your method is something called referential adequacy. This is the notion of, if you have a large database of data, withholding 10 or 15 or 20% of that data, performing your analysis on the initial pool of data, and then looking at that withheld data through the lens of what you found in the initial data. Again, that method won't work for all types of qualitative research. Feedback, and this can come in a lot of different forms. So you can have external audits. You can have someone who is an expert in your field, but who was not a part of your research and not on your team, take a look at your data. You can have a disinterested party. This might be someone who is tangential to your field, maybe has some knowledge of your field, but's not an expert, or even someone who's not in your field at all. Take a look at the data with fresh eyes and tell you whether or not it makes sense. You can have the study participants take a look at your data. So if you did things like focus groups or in-depth interviews, you can go back to the participants and say, this is what I got out of our interaction. Does this match with how you perceived it? Every one of these methods has pros and cons. And as I said, none of these methods are one size fits all. Different studies may have different checks and balances that make more sense. Um, an example of a con, like why might you not want to use one of these methods? If you have study participants, for example, look at your data after you've already put it all together. They may have changed their mind about how they feel about something, or they may look at something they said and be shamed or embarrassed, or maybe there was a vulnerable moment and now they're like, oh, I'm not sure I really want, that out there. So I'm going to say I didn't say that, and that's not what I meant. Recognition of bias, right? As I said, bias is not necessarily a bad thing, and we don't want to confuse bias with perception, right? So again, it's important to recognize our bias, but we don't necessarily want to go so far the other way that we strip important things out of our research because we're so worried about bias. So all of these checks and balances have pros and cons. They're all important, right? But we also want to make sure that they fit the method and they fit with what we're trying to do. So again, it's this notion of big picture. So final thoughts and conclusions. If our goal is to validate and evaluate qualitative research, how do we go about this in a systematic manner? Again, we want to start with determining whether or not the research is valid to us, the reader. Then we want to look at who is performing the research, any ulterior motives they might have, or who is funding the research. We want to look at how the research was conducted. Does it make sense within what we're trying to find? We want to look at, are there guardrails on the research? Are there safety nets? Did the researchers employ some method to ensure that there's quality control in their own research? Okay. And again, all of this should form one big picture. So when you are looking at qualitative research, it's a holistic approach. It's not any one thing. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Thank you so much for listening.